And so now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is a member of the Digital Disruption Research Group, Connie Henson. Where's Connie? Connie is the author of Brainwise Leadership, Practical Neuroscience to Survive and Thrive at Work, and she has a PhD in that field. She's founder and managing director of Learning Quest. She helps businesses improve how people work, and she integrates her background in neurobehavioral science and psychology with her practical business know-how to do so. She's also going to run a workshop this afternoon on creating the conditions to thrive, and she does many such workshops with governments, SMEs, and corporates. And so it's my absolute pleasure to have Connie speak. Connie's been with the group almost since the beginning, but it's the first time really, and I don't know why, that you're only now speaking after so many years, but it's great to have you. So the stage is all yours.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So as Kai said, I'm part of the Digital Disruption Research Group, and I have to admit, I was so excited when we landed upon the topic of what does success mean in a disrupted world? You know, what does that look like? Because my fascination with the relationship between disruption and thriving started at the very beginning of my career. Because I started out as a clinical health psychologist all those many years ago, and I specialized in working with people who had significant medical challenges, so things like severe burns, spinal cord, brain injuries, big disruptions in their life. And you know, early on, one thing that was really apparent is that different people responded in different ways to those disruptions in their life. And I noticed that, or you know, kind of inklings, it's like people's mindset and the environment around them played a role in that. Now, since that time, I've moved on from clinical work, and I've worked, you know, across lots of different kinds of organizations, you know, from CEOs to refugees. But still, what I notice is even when a group of people experience the same kind of disruption, there's a lot of variability in how they adapt to that, with some surviving and some thriving. And I got really curious about what are the conditions that make it go one way or the other? And so a few years ago, I embarked upon some research, which is not that normal for someone in my role, but decided I needed to really understand this a bit better. And so we've done a couple of pieces of research now to look at, you know, one, what do we mean by thriving? What does success actually look like when you've been through or in the middle of a disruption? And how do you push it in the direction that you want? So let me just pop over here. I'm gonna share a couple of different pieces of research with you. So one study, we looked at people who experienced some kind of disruption that they weren't expecting. It was something they didn't want and they didn't expect. The second time, we looked at people who chose to put themselves in a challenging circumstance. And ultimately, what we were trying to do is, can we learn enough to help people apply that at the individual level, at an organizational level, and even at a community level? So let me talk a little bit about this first study, because what we did is we interviewed people who went through some kind of disruption. So in some cases, it was, you know, they got retrenched at work. They got some kind of new job that they didn't want, or even personal challenges. So people had a medical diagnosis that was quite significant, life-threatening, or they had a breakdown in a relationship, or actually loss of family members. So quite significant challenges. And we asked them to tell us what the challenge was and to tell us what did they mean by thriving. Because the criteria was, to be in the study, they had to have been through a disruption, but to say that they indeed thrived as a part of it, or as a cause of it, or because of it. And then we asked, well, what do you think contributed to that? And what we found was pretty interesting. The disruptions were all manner of different things. No consistency there, all kinds of different stuff. But there was huge consistency in what they said thriving meant. And you know, following on perfectly from what Billy said, nobody said, I got more money. Even though some people did get more money. You know, these things happen, you get paid out, and That wasn't it. They didn't talk about more power, more influence. They didn't talk about a better job. Fundamentally, what people talked about is a personal growth. They changed. They changed personally as a result of it. And we can cluster it into several different areas. One is people had changes in their thinking, so increases in knowledge, confidence, self-awareness. They had changes in how they felt, so reductions in the unpleasant kinds of emotions, increases in more pleasant emotions, and changes in what they did, which I find really interesting because it's one thing to feel differently or to think differently, but to actually behave differently means something has changed fundamentally in your life. Then we also saw a lot of consistency in the conditions that contributed, but before I get to that, let me talk a little bit about the second study. Because when you do qualitative research and you're doing it kind of after the challenge, it's interesting and it is pretty cool. You get some great stories out of it, but you're always wondering, it's like, well, what if I'd been able to measure ahead of time? What would it have looked like? Were these people already thriving, for example, and they just think that the challenge or the disruption caused them to thrive? And I was pondering this, and other people that have done research in this area have the same kind of problem, because you don't know when a challenge is going to happen before it happens. It's kind of hard to measure that. I'm pondering, how might I do this? And I got lucky. I sit on the board for a not-for-profit organization called the Newtown Neighborhood Center. And the Newtown Neighborhood Center does what a lot of neighborhood centers, they provide a lot of services for the local community, including services for people who are experiencing homelessness. And just about the time I joined the board, they had done a street count in the Newtown area, and they'd found a 1,300% increase in the number of people sleeping rough. 1,300%. And in response to that, they did not get a 1,300% increase in their funding to deal with this. So in response, they had to be clever. And they were just getting ready to launch a pretty innovative program where their intention was to recruit, train, and deploy local volunteers, so just regular people like ourselves, to become what they called assertive outreachers. Now, assertive outreach, you've probably never heard that word, I hadn't heard it. Essentially what we're looking at is people who will go out onto the streets and meaningfully and purposefully engage with rough sleepers. And these are people without any training. They're like us, no social work training, none of that. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, this is perfect. Because I knew, just like probably most of you know, that engaging with a person who's sleeping rough on the street is not something that everybody does quite easily. In fact, most people find it very challenging. And in fact, many people find the idea of it so challenging, they'll cross to the other footpath. They won't even make eye contact. They completely avoid it. So I knew, even though they were getting volunteers, what a perfect opportunity. This was going to be challenging for them. So I partnered with the NNC to do this second study. So that way we were able to do some measurement up front. We were able to then do the program, or they did the program, and then I could measure afterwards. And what we found is some pretty interesting things. We had some nice numbers around it, and I'll just share some of this. And I'm just going to share a few things. It was quite a comprehensive piece of work that we did, but I've picked out a few things that I think are particularly relevant for disruptions at work, because that's probably what most of you are dealing with. So what I've got there is we used a 5-point scale, and I've collapsed it down. So I'm looking at the changes that people said, well, I have, an increase in my knowledge. So the number of people, the percentage of people who said I have, a greater or a great deal of knowledge before and then after, and in this case, confidence. So I'm looking at this first category, which is thinking. The pre is always in red, the post is always in blue, and you don't need to look at the specific numbers, the detail's not that important, but you can see there were changes. People had increased knowledge, they had increased confidence as they went through this program. Now keep in mind, this program was, they came in, they were recruited, they had just, 16 hours of training, and then they're on the streets. They're out there talking with people. So they had an increase in knowledge. Well, yeah, they learned sometimes, but they had a confidence about being able to do this. And the same thing, I think, is I picked this because it's important. Any kind of disruption that we deal with, we have to learn things. We have to be able to have the confidence to do things differently. So these are important regardless of the disruption that you're dealing with or the challenge. A second area that I think is important is the change in emotion. And I particularly was interested in this because, and many of you will know this, although it is perfectly normal and reasonable to have unpleasant emotion when things change, when you feel disrupted or you deal with challenges. The problem is if you continue to have those unpleasant emotions sustain, then you have poor health outcomes, poor well-being, and poor performance. And so you want to see those change. And so indeed, we saw that in the first study where people said, yeah, I dropped right down when something happened, but came back. And we saw the same thing in this situation where people had experienced a lot of unpleasant emotion at the beginning, but that reduced towards the end. I don't have it up here, but we had an increase in the more positive emotions. And in that second study, even things around joy, which was pretty exciting. The third area that we looked at is behavior. Now, this is, I think, particularly interesting, especially following Billy's presentation around doing the right thing. Because I think we all know knowing the right thing to do and doing the right thing are two very different things. And that's where your knowledge, your confidence is like, yeah, that's one part, but part two is, do you do it? And so what we looked at is two different kinds of behavior, what I would call your pro-social behavior. So this is purposeful, engaging in meaningful behavior that you intend to do that actually has a pro-social quality to it, something that's actually useful for the world. And then the second thing we looked at, and you'll notice it's reversed here. I've got my pre and my post have turned around. We're looking at avoidance, and this is really important. Just as I alluded to earlier, when we were looking at the outreachers, we know that most people in the community, when they see a rough sleeper, people literally change to the other footpath. They definitely avoid eye contact. There's an avoidance there. When this happens in a work-related situation or in other kinds of disruptions that we have, the problem is people avoid things, the very things that they probably need. So I'm about to be retrenched, but I'm avoid making a CV. That would be all too hard because that means it's happening. Or learning a new skill. Or avoiding the relationships that are probably going to be the things that I need the most to help me. So if we can reduce avoidance, that's really important, and we know that makes a difference. Now, these are all the numbers, but I want to show you, both of these studies were qualitative, and the beauty of qualitative work is just such cool stories come out of it. And so I'm going to just show you one quote that I absolutely loved, and I think it encapsulates a lot of what we saw, particularly in the second study. So it reminded me that I don't like to talk to people, especially strangers. But going up with strangers is hard, but you got to put your big boy pants on. It becomes easier. Practice makes it easier. And I love that because I think it's so insightful. It says it's hard. Strangers are hard, and Billy talked about that. It's like, this is the trust. We don't know people. And especially a stranger that seems very different. But when we do that, when we put the big girl pants on, the big boy pants on, whatever we've got, and then we start acting on it, that's key. That kind of behavior is key to thriving. It's active. It's not a passive thing. I'm going to talk just very quickly. If you come to my workshop this afternoon, we're going to talk more about this. What are the conditions that enable people to thrive? There are several important things. Number one, absolutely, positively, is safety. It is essential. It is fundamental to thriving. 100% of the people who describe themselves as having thrived felt safe after their disruption or at some point in their disruption. When we feel unsafe, we don't function well. All of the neurobehavioral research supports this. It's not just physical safety, it's psychological safety, and it's the perception of, not the objective of. Three other things are important. These are what I call connectedness, control, and contribution. Connectedness is about relationships. And I think probably most of us would know when you experience a disruption in your life, having supportive relationships is important. What you might not realize is the counterintuitive finding that everybody that thrives has a person, at least one relationship in their life, that's that irritating person, that tough love person. That says, I don't care if you're tired, I don't care if you hurt, you're getting up and you're going to do this. And we need that kind of person in our life, whether they are a professional person that's helping us or they're a friend or a family member. So connectedness, and there's lots of other interesting things also related to relationships. Control is also important. You got things there about predictability, things about autonomy, fairness, all of that goes into control. And we need, and I don't usually have to convince people that sense of control is important to be, to just be effective, much less thrive. And then finally, this notion of contribution. We have to be able to make a valuable and valued contribution. And that's what happens when people get a disruption in their life, be it personal or work-wise. We start to wonder, it's like, is what I'm doing valuable? And is it valued? And when we shift that, it's like you pull the rug out from underneath people. And so for people to thrive, I actually think probably to survive, they've got to be able to feel like they can make a contribution in whatever way that happens. And so that becomes the final one. Look, I know there's so many things that you'll be taking today and hearing about, and I hope that if there's one thing that you can take away from what I'm telling you, I want you to take away this safety piece. And I emphasize this because many of you are in roles where you can impact safety in your organizations. You're in leadership roles, you're in influence roles. And disruption is not going to go away. If anything, I don't know what it's going to look like, there'll be more. And people struggle with it. People struggle with challenge. But if we can create safety, we've got the foundation. And so that's what I ask you to think about and take away. Think about how do you create safety for the people around you and for yourself. Thank you.